Imagine a world where the most revolutionary art ever created was dismissed as a communist fever dream by the very critics who claim to be the gatekeepers of culture. Right now, in the world's most prestigious galleries, pieces that were once hidden in Siberian basements to escape destruction are being insured for hundreds of millions of dollars. But before we reveal how these worthless canvases became the ultimate status symbols for the Western elite, I have a question for you. Where are you joining us from today? Drop your city and country in the comments below. It's fascinating to see how far this story reaches. Stay with us because the tale of the Russian avant-garde isn't just about paint on a canvas. It's a story of smuggling, state-sponsored execution, and a massive Western about-face that redefined the art market forever. We are about to dive into a saga of creative rebellion that the world tried to bury, only to realize too late that it was the foundation of everything we call modern. The story truly begins in the freezing, flickering light of early 20th century Moscow, a city on the brink of total collapse and rebirth. While Paris was obsessed with the soft edges of Impressionism, a group of Russian radicals led by Kazimir Malevich and Lissitzky were busy smashing the very concept of beauty. They didn't want to paint flowers or aristocrats. They wanted to paint the future. Malevich's black square was a middle finger to 500 years of artistic tradition, a literal void that swallowed the past whole. But when news of this supremacist movement trickled into the velvet-lined salons of London and New York, the reaction wasn't awe. It was pure, unadulterated mockery. Western critics, comfortably insulated by their classical education, viewed these works as nothing more than visual propaganda for a chaotic regime. They saw geometric shapes as a lack of talent rather than a breakthrough in human perception, labeling the entire movement as a primitive byproduct of political upheaval that would surely be forgotten by the next decade. As the Soviet Union tightened its grip under Stalin, the irony began to thicken like drying oil paint. The very regime that birthed this radical creativity suddenly turned against it, declaring socialist realism, paintings of happy peasants and sturdy tractors, as the only legal art form. The avant-garde masters were branded as bourgeois formalists, their work stripped from museum walls and shoved into damp storerooms or worse, burned. This created a tragic paradox. While the Soviet state was busy erasing its own geniuses, Western critics remained equally dismissive, though for different reasons. To the West, this art was too red. To the Soviets, it was too Western. Malevich died in poverty, and others fled or vanished into the Gulags. The masterpieces were effectively orphaned, caught in a geopolitical pincer movement that should have deleted them from history. Yet, in the shadows, a few daring collectors and underground curators began to realize that what they were looking at wasn't just art. It was the blueprint for the 20th century, hidden in plain sight. The turning point arrived with a whisper, then a roar as the Cold War reached its peak. A few visionary Westerners, most notably George Kostakis, began hunting for these discarded relics in the back alleys of Moscow. Kostakis, a Greek embassy employee, spent his life savings buying canvases that people were literally using to patch holes in their roofs. When he finally brought some of these works to the West in the late 1970s, the derision began to melt into a desperate, greedy realization. The very museums that had laughed at the Russian junk suddenly saw the DNA of minimalist and abstract art within them. The Guggenheim, the MoMA, and the Tate realized they had a massive, gaping hole in their narrative of art history. They had spent decades praising Western masters like Pollock and Rothko without acknowledging that the Russians had done it all first, and with a much higher stakes price tag of life and death. The shift from communist trash to indispensable masterpiece happened almost overnight, sparking one of the most aggressive acquisition wars in the history of the art world. This brings us to the ultimate cultural impact story, the resurrection of the Russian avant-garde. It is a tale of how a single canvas can go from being a crime against the state to a billion-dollar asset. The sheer hypocrisy of the Western art market was laid bare as auction houses like Sotheby's began pulling in record-breaking numbers for artists they had ignored for half a century. Today, these works are the crown jewels of the very institutions that once mocked them. This isn't just a change in taste. It's a total validation of a group of rebels who believed that art could change the soul of humanity. The Western critics didn't just change their minds. They were forced to concede that the center of the artistic universe wasn't Paris or New York in 1915. It was a desperate, starving, and revolutionary Russia. The masterpieces won the long game, proving that true genius is a fire that cannot be extinguished by politics or snobbery. Let's look closer at the sheer scale of the 500-word paragraph requirement. Every stroke of a constructivist brush represented a literal gamble with the firing squad. When we talk about the masterpieces sought by museums today, We aren't talking about objects created for profit. Vladimir Tatlin, for instance, designed his monument to the Third International as a structure that would dwarf the Eiffel Tower, symbolizing a new era of human achievement. Western critics at the time called it a utopian pipe dream, a skeletal monstrosity that could never be built. Yet, decades later, architectural historians and museum directors look at Tatlin's sketches as the precursor to high-tech architecture and modern structural engineering. The irony is staggering. The very people who ridiculed the impossible nature of Russian art are now the ones paying millions for the sketches of those impossibilities. The museums aren't just buying art, they are buying the edge and the grit that they lacked in their own sanitized histories. The hunt for these works in the 1980s and 90s felt more like a spy thriller than an art acquisition. Dealers would fly into a collapsing Soviet Union with suitcases of cash, looking for the descendants of artists like Popova or Stepanova. These women were the Amazons of the avant-garde, female artists who held equal footing with men, a concept the West hadn't even dreamed of achieving at the time. While London galleries were still largely boys' clubs, the Russian avant-garde was a gender-blind explosion of talent. When these works finally hit the Western market, the impact was seismic. It forced a rewrite of the entire feminist art history narrative. Museums were suddenly desperate to prove they were progressive by acquiring works from the very movement they had dismissed as primitive propaganda just a generation earlier. This scramble for acquisitions wasn't just about the art. It was about the West trying to absorb the intellectual energy of a revolution it had spent decades trying to suppress. Consider the case of Mark Rothko, the titan of American abstract expressionism. For years, he was heralded as the pioneer of the color field. But once the Russian avant-garde works of artists like Olga Rozanova became widely known in the West, the connection became undeniable. Rozanova was experimenting with transrational painting and pure color blocks years before the New York School even existed. The Western art world had a choice: admit they were late to the party or rewrite the timeline to make the Russians look like influences rather than the originators. They chose the latter for a long time, but the weight of the evidence, the sheer vibrancy and technical mastery of the Russian works, eventually broke the dam. Now, when you walk through the MoMA, you see the Russian masters placed at the very beginning of this story of modernism. It is a silent apology rendered in the form of gold leaf frames and climate-controlled glass. The financial aspect of this redemption arc is perhaps the most viral part of the story. A Malevich that might have been traded for a loaf of bread in 1930 now commands prices upwards of $85 million at auction. This massive appreciation in value reflects a broader cultural trend: the commodification of rebellion. The Western elite, who once feared the revolutionary message behind these shapes, now use them as the ultimate flex of intellectual and financial power. It's a strange fate for an art movement that wanted to abolish private property and bring beauty to the masses. The museums seeking these masterpieces are participating in a grand irony, taking the art of the proletariat and locking it behind the high-security vaults of the 1%. This tension is what makes the Russian avant-garde so enduringly fascinating. It is art that refuses to be tamed, even when it is bought and sold for the price of a private jet. This narrative also touches on the concept of artistic bravery. Many of these artists knew their work would never be seen in their lifetimes. They painted for a future they believed in, even as that future was being dismantled by the Stalinist machine. When Western critics finally discovered this bravery, they packaged it as a triumph of the individual over the state. But for the artists, it was a triumph of the idea over the material. Museums today aren't just collecting canvases. They are collecting the echoes of a lost utopia. Every time a major museum like the Getty or the Pompidou hosts a Russian avant-garde retrospective, they are acknowledging a debt. They are acknowledging that the radicalism of the 20th century didn't start in a New York loft, but in a cramped, cold Moscow studio where a group of visionaries decided that a red circle and a black line were enough to change the world forever. As we reach the final act of this story, we have to look at the fakes market that has exploded alongside the demand. Because these works were hidden for so long and their provenance is often murky, moving through the hands of secret collectors and panicked relatives, the market is flooded with high-quality forgeries. This has created a new kind of drama. Museum curators and scientific experts using carbon dating and X-rays to verify the souls of these paintings. It's a testament to the value of the Russian avant-garde that people are willing to risk millions on a work that might have been painted in a basement in the 1990s rather than the 1910s. The desperation to own a piece of this history is so high that the risk is considered part of the game. It's the ultimate validation of a movement that was once deemed worthless. Now, it's so valuable that it's worth faking. The story of the Russian avant-garde is a mirror held up to the Western ego. It shows us that what we dismiss today might be the masterpiece of tomorrow. It warns us against the arrogance of thinking we know what good art is based on current political or social trends. The critics of the 1920s and 30s failed to see the genius because they were blinded by their own biases. Today's museums are trying to fix that mistake, but in doing so, they have turned a revolutionary movement into a luxury brand. We must ask ourselves, if a new radical movement emerged today, would we recognize it, or would we mock it just like the critics mocked Malevich? The cycle of derision and desire is a fundamental part of the human story, and nowhere is it more visible than in the jagged, colorful, and defiant lines of the Russian masters. Think about the cultural impact of this shift. It changed how we design our cities, how we format our websites, and even how we conceptualize space and time. Constructivism, a branch of the avant-garde, moved art off the canvas and into the streets, into posters, and into clothing. The Western aesthetic we enjoy today, clean lines, bold typography, functionalism, is essentially a filtered version of Russian radicalism. When museums seek these pieces, they are searching for the source code. They are trying to find the spark that ignited the modern world. The fact that this spark came from a place that was politically enemy territory for so long only adds to the mystique and the power of the work. So we come back to the beginning. The fever dream wasn't a dream at all, it was a premonition. The Russian avant-garde artists were the first to understand that the old world was dying and that a new, fragmented, and fast-paced world was taking its place. They captured the sound of the machine age and the spirit of total transformation. The Western critics who derided them were simply afraid of that change. But as we've seen, you can't fight the future forever. Eventually, the galleries will open their doors, the collectors will open their checkbooks, and the worthless squares and circles will take their rightful place at the center of the human narrative. The Russian avant-garde didn't just survive, it conquered. As we wrap up this journey through art, ego, and global politics, I want to thank you for sticking with us. The story of the Russian avant-garde is a powerful reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how much criticism or erasure it faces. It's a testament to the enduring power of human creativity. If you found this story as captivating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories of our world. And before you go, tell us, do you think art should be political or should it stay in its own world? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. Would you like me to do a follow-up on the most famous art heists involving these specific masterpieces?